Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Jacqueline says, hi Don, wave emoji. I hope you had a great day. Yeah, I did, Jacqueline, thanks. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Itchy Foreskin says, can you flip it so you're looking to the left again? This feels wrong. No. Alicia says, hey, remember me? Yeah, I remember you. Estinky says, hi, hello Estinky. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Bird Beast says, hello Bird Beast. Hey, it's Ava says, why are you flipped around? I changed the camera. Tricky says, how long have you been live? 1 minute. PE says, chat doesn't know Dawn is actually his title. Like the Mafia or something. Itchy Foreskin says, would you ever visit Guantanamo Bay? No. GLO says, 2, 1 plus 2, 6 plus... I'm not gonna do that math. XX Andrew Plays says, hi. Hello, Andrew. Hey, it's Ava says, what's your favorite food? The Big Mac. Rich says, where are you from? USA. GC says, hi, my name is Racial Slur from India. Hello, Racial Slur. Jason says, hey. Hello, Jason. Jason Kelly says something in Arabic, I think. I don't know what that means. Oven says, you look like a highly intelligent man. Thank you. Itchy Foreskin says, would you ever get in a boxing match with a serial killer? No. Jaden says, K. Okay. Pathan says, winky face, pants emoji. I don't know what that's about. Eli says, I'm a car. Okay. Anthony says, yeah, it was bad. It ran. Message retracted. Okay. Birdbee says, do you think 3i Atlas has aliens on it? I don't know what 3i Atlas is. Cobb says, is God? What? Camilla says, I'm scared to eat the Boldak. I don't know what that means. Itchy Foreskin says, why did you say K 3 times? Thinking emoji, you're not slicked on. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Eli says, vroom vroom. Okay. Brittany says, I think you are cute, sir. Thanks. Ava says, do you ever sleep? Yes. Yep says, Chumley is cool from Pawn Stars. TJ says, you look cool, dude. Adding you to my friends club. You my neighbor now. Okay. Dino says, dude, stop. No. Valiant says, gay gang. Okay. Cobb says, was Plankton's business model doomed to fail? Yeah. Jason says, have a blessed day, my friend. You too, Jason. Scallywag says, Trump a frumpy diddler? What? Code says, this guy is gay. No. Yep says, Diddy Dookie Glock. Okay. Kevin says, 3 armed guard versus a pigeon. You call that a fair fight? No. Johnny Depp says, this is a bizarre show. Yes. Safi says, hello sexy. Hello Safi. Code says, hello. My neighbor is a dumb woman of a specific race in her 50s who doesn't bathe and poops in Walmart bags. Okay. Come on my nut says, I am shit worms and blood. You're shitting worms and blood. Sorry to hear that. Luis says, what kind of tism you got? I don't know. Victoria says, laughing emoji. This is great. Laughing my ass off. Glad you like it. Kato says, do you know the Muffin Man? No. Eli says, Spurs 2026 champs. Okay. Oven Association says, I love kits. You wanted me to say I love kids? Okay. Lucas says something in Spanish. I don't know what that means. Mamita says hi. Hello, Mamita. Johnny Depp says, did Israel kill Charlie Kirk? I don't think so. Brittany says, that shit worms and blood guy trolling all over right now. He's trolling? Okay. Jason says, yeah, creep. Okay. Ide says hi. Wave emoji. Doing okay. Yes, I am doing okay. Thank you. Litz says pre-crash out. I'm not gonna get angry. Valiant says a gay creep. Okay. Sandwich says ism stream. Autism stream. Okay. Seif says good. Okay. 85 says, how long have you been live? 7 minutes, I think. Friday the 13th says, hey, my baga. Okay. Icarus says, hit the dab, bro. No. AM says, this neighbor looks possessed. Okay. MP says, stimulants, huh? No. Kato says, do you smoke weed? No. Amber says, what's the most interesting thing about you? I'm not gonna say. CM says, I do not have the carnival worker skull filter on. What? Victoria Stone says, you look like iCarly's uncle. I don't know iCarly's uncle. Cade Mate says, what is your purpose? To survive and reproduce. Crystal says, do you have legs? I do. Jason says, why are you here? Streamin'? Are you talking about streamin' for fun? Jackson says, Hawk Tua on my dick? No. Albert says, are you a skinwalker or AI or real? I'm real. Cowboy says, I'm pretty sure we shotgunned some beers back in the day. We haven't done that together. Seether says, what is your major malfunction? I think you forgot numbnuts. Tenrag says, do you know Keith? I don't. Anna says hi. Hello, Anna. Amber says, what's your favorite thing to do? One of my favorite things to do is edit videos, make videos. Durr says, hi there, do you play poker? I don't. Izzy says, I'm ready to leave my physical form. Don't do that. Rafika says, what food do you eat? McDonald's. Mr. Nice Guy says, my friend is gay. Are you? I'm not. Malcolm says, you show up every night on shorts before I got to sleep. Like the Sandman. Okay. Callie Prince says, rumor has it you had a couple of facial skin grafts. Nope. June Gates says, I'm gay. Okay. Sandra says, can you please see my comment? What is your favorite country? I guess the United States, but I'm biased because I live here. Mamita says, did YouTube pay your monthly salary? I haven't got paid at all by YouTube. Ben Sketch says, why are you famous? I don't know why there's people here. Random account says, serial killer. Okay. Liam says, you look like a serial killer, but I'm guaranteeing that you'll call. What? Cowboy says, is it true you're a Freemason? No, I'm not a part of that society. Bobby says, shoe dough is on shrooms. What? Earth Suck says, you have a weird cranium. I do. Blah says, why do you do this? For fun. John says, bait or mental dumbness. I mean, it's not bait, so if I have the only other option, then I guess the dumbness. Callie Price says, my hoochie stinky. You wanted me to say my coochie is stinky? Okay. SGT Chris says, can you see my comment? Yes. AM says, just go to bed? No. Michael says, you look cool. Thank you. Rajat says, will you go out and get a pet fish maybe? No. Maceo says, are the bills really that high? I don't get paid. Emmy says, hello. Hello, Emmy. L says, gay, gay, gay. Okay. Colin says, how many eggs do you eat in one sitting? 2. Joe Stank says, do you like Radiohead? Yes. Mr. Nice Guy says, bruh, stop spamming gay. Yeah, spam is annoying. Classical Anime says, are you Asian? No. The Solar Ram says, Pookie Mookie Wookie. Okay. Lewis says, can we see your search history? No. Itchy Foreskin says, Don, has anyone ever told you that you look like Sheen from Jimmy Neutron? The only person that's told me that is myself. Terrelyn says, so sad that there are so many ignorant people on here right now. I don't mind the crazy comments. Xanda says, blink twice if you're being held hostage. I'm not. Emmy says, blink twice if you're being held hostage. That's crazy how both of you guys typed the same exact thing and sent it at the same time. No Cloud says, do you eat it on the second date? No. Cowboy says, you should start a cult? No. Carl says, he's a psycho. I'm a psycho. No, I'm not. Xanda says, is crazy, laughing my ass off. Okay. Colin says, do you have any posters in your kitchen? No, I don't. No Clout says, how many dates to eat it? I don't know, but not 2. Nick B says, favorite movie? Eyes Wide Shut. Brittany says, dude, awesome cult leader. I would make an awesome cult leader. Okay. Carl says, he probably has bodies in the basement. I do not. Mr. Nice Guy says, hello, ma'am. How are you doing on this fine evening? Good. Nick B says, pineapple on pizza. Yeah, I like pineapple on pizza. Sir Salty says, nice Dexter outfit. Is this an outfit Dexter would wear? No Cloud says, I would enjoy watching you eat it. Okay. Lauren Bailey says, winky face emoji with tongue out. Lots of other emojis. Okay. Gain says, you prefer Eyes Wide Shut to Mulholland Drive? I haven't watched that movie. Don Enrico says, I subscribe, you're chill as fuck. Okay. Mark says he doesn't want to say if Diddy didified the didification process already. Well, I don't know what that means. Hey, it's Ava says, have you blinked before? Yes. Lollipop says, I like your teeth. Thank you. Rock says, Rock said Don is a NPC. Okay. Virtual says, Asian Edward Cullen. No, more like Mexican. No Cloud says, nonchalant Kirk. Okay. Grab Me says, you remind me of Bruce Wayne. Okay. Vex R says, ain't no God watching me. Okay. Emmy says, watch the language. Remember, God is always watching. I don't believe in God, but thank you. Shelby says, is this always your emotions? No. Brittany says, watch the movie Serbian Film. I heard it was a very gross film, so I don't want to. LX says, I'm calling 911. They're sending help. I don't need emergency services. The Mosquito says, depressed with eyes a mile apart. Okay. Sevillepo says, who's your favorite band? Arcade Fire. No Clout YT says, okay. Okay. Jamal DeQuifa says, Freaky Dawn, did you like my new edit? I haven't watched it. Nice to see you again. CoolTube says, do you like techno? No. Jamal DeQuifa says, Daddy Jamal is back. Yeah, you're back. Joseph says, what's up from Nebraska? Hello, Joseph. Sadamore says, racial slur. Okay. Killamash says, do you need help? I do not. Gemini says, is this how your facial expressions are normally? I think I'm more expressive when I'm talking person to person. Grayman says, God is Satan and he wants to kill you. Okay. I'm Blake Cooper says, so you're not an empath? I don't know. Almost Famous says, my dick is too big, I can't find a girlfriend. Okay. Carl says, are you a serial killer? You seem like one. I'm not. Jackson says, eat. I'm not gonna eat on stream. Victoria Stone says, I think some of these people are disturbed. No, I think they're just regular people and they are anonymous, so they can be their crazy selves. Little Man says, bro thinks he's Wednesday. I don't. Richard says, I am so fucking dumb. You wanted me to say I'm so fucking dumb? Okay. Boba says, you're back again? Yeah, I'm back. Steven says, laughing out loud? Okay. I'm Blake Cooper says, are you autistic? No. Ajax says, I'm gay, no one will see this. I did. Carl says, he's a robot or he's a serial killer. No way he's not. I'm not either of those. Vex says, Emmy, shut your bitch ass up. You want Emmy in the chat to shut up? Okay. Claire Sellers says, hi, angry emoji. Hello, Claire. Dora B says, can you laugh? that happens sometimes. Boba says, are you a Sigma boy? I don't know. Brianna says, you're a nice person. Don't let no one get to ya. They don't. Big Randy says, I'm being forced to say this. Sorry to hear that. April says, hello from Ireland. Hello, April. God says, what is your favorite food? The Big Mac. Father says, I love Hot Wheels. Okay. Satamore says, Dawn is the best. Thank you. Down with the System says, what is the point of spamming this chat? To get my attention, unfortunately. The Mosquito says, I'm forcing Big Randy to say that. You were the guy forcing Big Randy to say that. Okay. Nick B says Squidward. Okay. Little Man says, why you got no energy? I don't know. Valiant says, #1 gay streamer. I am. I don't think of myself as that. PE says, suppose you could say parasocial with Don Benitez. Okay. Joey says, why serious? I don't know. Boba says, can you say 6'7"? I'm not doing the gesture. Zero says, what time is it for you? Nighttime. Down with the System says, is there any other ideas to the channel than reading chat? No, this is it. Jacqueline says, you laughed. I did? Okay. Ajax says, gooning time. You're gonna masturbate right now? Okay. Someone says, hey man, don't give up. Keep doing you. Thank you. Jamal DeQuifa says, what do your farts smell like? I don't want to think about it. I hate farts. Big Randy says, drugs are good. Okay. Rafael says, you look like the Mexican friend in white Hollywood movies they use for diversity. Okay. I'm Blake Cooper says, you broke character. I'm not playing a character. Hey, it's Ava says, I see those beautiful eyelashes. What serum do you use? Nothing. Killamash says, are you autistic? No. Saya says, what the? Okay. The Mosquito says, Shark Boy, all grown up. Okay. Cowboy says, maybe it's maybe line. What? Yolanda says, you look like H1T1. Okay. Emmy says, these freaky people need help. Alright. Diego says, you ever just... What? Zaza says, do you want a dono? I am not monetized yet. Christy says, me so sad. Okay. Vex R says, nah, Emmy, you need help. Okay. Tar says, is this a normal stream? Yes. God says, only person here who needs help is the person constantly telling people they need help. Okay. Perp says, how much meat you packing? Not gonna say. Saya says, do you ever smoke the giggle bush? No. Veronica says, laughing emoji. Okay. Ghost Samurai says, cyber bullies. What's up, homies? Okay. Abbles says, what's your favorite emotion? Love. The Smokestack Relic says, heart emoji. Okay. Bane says, giggle bush is cringe, you goof ass. Okay. Raphael says, Shark Boy with schizophrenia. Okay. Nick B says, what kind of vids you like to edit? I like make compilations of like things just for my own like pleasure. Dazman says, wanna smoke heroin with me? No. Jamal DeQuifa says, Buldak or spicy noodles, Don? Okay. Ton says, can you say Trump is gay? No. Porter says, diddly doing. Okay. Red says, if you say okay, I will assault my neighbor. All right. Jamal DeQuifa says, Boldak are spicy noodles. Are they really? I'm worried I'm saying something insane. Art with personality says, can you... Okay. What? Casemiro says, are you a very closeted person? Sure. Yazdan says, have you ever made a snowman? Yes. Jesse says, what's your favorite horror movie? The Shining. Ton says, can you say Trump has a small ween? No. Grasshopper says, I'm in your closet. No, you're not. John Dalton says, I like tater tots. Okay. Girk says, I'm not gonna lie, this whole chat is wild. Okay. The Mosquito says, make it clap. What? Vex says, I love oiled up femboys. Okay. Zaza says, RPG or FPS. FPS. Saya says, crying emoji. Okay. Casemiro says, meth dealing chihuahuas. That's my business idea. I don't think that's gonna go well. Jitesh says, do you remember me? I remember your name. Ton says, you won't say it because you are scared he will come after you. No. Terror says, have you eaten your veggies? No, I gotta get on that. Little Man says, I betcha most of the people in this chat are gooners. I don't think so. Lon says, what are your hobbies? Video editing. Sashka says, I think you have something there. What do you mean? Red says, you look like the Gemini killer from Dexter. Okay. Bacon Block says, did he love you? Did he loves me? Okay. Dirt and Deliverance says, how long have you been emo? If I'm emo, I don't know how long. Zaza says, Battlefield 6 or the finals? Battlefield 6. Jitesh says, is $100 expensive to you? I guess so. So you make music for gay people says, what's your favorite color? Gray. Rafael says, you look like you have sex through the hole in your boxers. Okay. Tim says, Jesus loves you. Okay. Mark says, free Diddy. No. Clay says, do you watch the UFC? I don't. Tar Williams says, who is a better Sherlock, Downey Jr. or Cumberbatch? Cumberbatch. X says, am I innocent or guilty? Innocent. Null says, which One Piece deck are you using these days? What? Jason says, his eye. Is there something wrong with my eye? Eid says, can you run long distances? No. Clay says, you ever take X and just reflect on life? No. No Name says, do you support the RSF Liberation of Sudan? I don't know about it. Jitesh says, what do you think of Brad Pitt? He's an actor, and that's cool. Lono says, is this your only channel? You might as well think of it that way. Like, this is the only channel I think I care about. The Mosquito says, let me nibble on your earlobes. No. Zaza says, how many languages do you know? Just one. Bane says, do you support Xbox decision to up their prices on Game Pass? I mean, no. Swamp Rat says, you go hunting? I don't. Itchy Foreskin says, let's say you were to murder someone. Where would you hide the body? I don't know, I'm not gonna say. El Capo says, what's the point of this? For fun. Radiohead says, smile? No. Mr. Bacon says, wow. Okay. Perp says, you gonna play with your worm after the stream? No. Nick B says, what's the goal for this channel? Just to have fun. Pappy says, do you know what is 6-7, a meme? Jitesh says, which horror game do you like the most? I haven't played horror games. Jixon says, do you love 10-year-olds? Not romantically. Aura Underground says, how do you feel about the... what? Itchy Foreskin says, have you ever had your finger slip in your ass when you wipe? No. Timu Mark Grayson says, do you like my poo cheese stanky? You wanted me to say my coochie stinky? Okay. Bane says, Overwatch is ass. I played it and had a little fun. Aria says, what's your nationality? American. Zaza says, what is the game you last played? Minecraft. Lon says, favorite book? Wisdom of Life by Schopenhauer. Ress says, how did you die? I'm not dead. The Eraser says, do you have pink eye right now? If my eye is messed up, it's because of how long I stare at screens. Jitesh says, do you know what the first effect of radiation? I don't know that. What is it? I'm curious. Itchy Foreskin says, favorite racial slur? I don't have one. Dylan says, is this some interview shit? I guess so. Jitesh says, do you know what is the first effect of radiation? Again, I don't know. Timu says, after you scratch your mic hunt, do you sniff it? No. Sadman says, what's your job? I'm gonna keep that private. John says, what do you vote for? I hate racial slurs. What? The Other Side says, do you like combat sports? I don't play them. Zaza says, do you enjoy playing alone or with others? Others. Colin says, how would you survive the rabies virus? Hiding. Perp says, should I run my grandma over in my red Prestine 98 Camry? No. Booty says, how is daddy's good little boy doing? What? Shape-shifting sweetheart says, hello boyfriend, hello shape-shifting. God says, I pooped on my ops and the cops are on me. Good luck. Rez says, do you know what a 5-head is? No. Dirt and Deliverance says, okay, spill the beans. How many kids are in your basement? I don't kidnap people. Pink says, what specific race of ass do you prefer to eat? What? Rafael says, bro smoked half a joint, so only one eye is red. Okay. Jamal DeQuifa says, my Hispanic Latino king, can I please have permission to go poop? Yes. Saya says, can we kidnap you and force you to eat pancakes for 24 hours straight? No, I don't want to do that. Luis Money says, favorite gang? What? Yazdan says, there is a sneaky golem approaching my house. Sneaky golems are fictional. Jackson says, I'm a bust. Okay. Jules says, saw it. Saw what? Red says, would you rather overdose while playing Overwatch or get eaten by cannibals playing Overwatch? Anon Core says, man broke character at the joint joke. I'm not playing a character. Jamal DeQuifa says, why have you been streaming earlier lately, my Hispanic Latino king? No reason in particular. OG says, some crack with Jack Black. Okay. Alberto says, peace dude, love you bro. Okay. Joel says, you look like my son. Okay. Zaza says, you play on a server or local? A server, my own server. Diamond says, "What's up, little Chinese boy?" Hello, Diamond. Joseph says, "You should add this on Twitch." Maybe. T.S. says, "Bruh, how you get all these views on your streams with no history?" Oh, I've streamed a lot more, but I privated those streams. Colin says, "You look like my son." Okay. Dirt and Deliverance says, "Who is behind you?" Nobody. Shape-shifting Sweetheart says, "You so fine, bruh. Got a good nut out of me. Phew." Okay. Ziazdan says, "Who is Diddy? He sent me a party invite." A rapist, I heard. Luke Wright says, "No worries, Saya." Okay. Jitesh says, "Do you know how much is 4 times 10 to the 77th power?" I don't know. Little Man says, "Blink if you need help, gang." I'm fine. Timu says, "Do you like studs that have BBC?" No. The Mosquito says, "Diddy was now, he's the raped." What? Mathematics says, "I feel grateful for the gift of sight. And every time I look at you, I'm reminded of just how lucky I am." Thank you. Kurt says, "I hope you gave Firewall on that server." Yeah, Mountains of Lava is not gonna come for me. Perp says, "Daddy, when will you host a meet and greet?" 5 years from now. Saya says, "By the way, we appreciate your entertainment, Mr. Sir." You're welcome. Jamie says 6'7". Okay. Jamal DeQuifa says, "Why did you private them? Is it because of gulp? Peas a little?" Yeah, because of that. Fozia says, "Why is Trump orange?" I don't know. Yazdan says, "Do you play Clash Royale?" No. Shape-shifting Sweetheart says, "Is sexual assault ever justified?" No. Zaza says, "Do you have DS server?" I'm not gonna allow you guys to join my Minecraft server. Aura Underground says, "Would you fuck a midget?" No comment. Donut says, "Are you gay?" No. Poppy says, "Did you know that we have 5 fingers?" Yeah, I mean 10 in total. Dark Blue says, "Have you even slept?" I'm running on a good amount of sleep right now. Down with a System says, "No comment equals a yes." No, it doesn't. Ton says, "Do you watch Blacked Corn videos?" No. Khaled says, "Ma Mia, here we go again. Where are you from, boss man?" USA. Res says, "You're like a custom Fallout 4 character." Okay. Zaza says, "Are we fun?" Yeah, you're more entertaining than most books I've read. Yazdan says, "There is a man with a black mask. He said he's gonna Swiss cheese me." Get out of there. Poppy says, "Are you racist?" No. Ton says, "Why you lie?" Because it's a human thing to lie. Fazia says, "What is your favorite food?" The Big Mac. Timu says, "What type of BBC do you like?" None. God says, "What if I divide you by 0? Don't do that, please. Brad Piff says, "Are you socially awkward?" I think so. Eric says, "Do you remember me?" Yes, I do. Your wife says, "Roblox headass." Okay. Elb says, "What's your opinion on BBC Better Black Community?" That abbreviation, those words, I guess that sounds good. Marvel Cuphead says, "Remember me?" No. Dirt and Deliverance says, is that your wife behind you? No. Donut says, are you 21? Maybe. Pilford says, have you ever kneeled down and blown a racial slur? No. TZ says, what is the goal of these streams? Fun. Entertainment. Kurt says, shut your bitch ass up, nerd? No. Mayan says, hi, what's up? What's your sport and video game? Basketball and Minecraft. La Tuck says, do you think you could beat me in a 1v1 in basketball? No. Aura Underground says, are you bisexual or just gay? Straight. Yazdan says, do you watch video game Let's Plays? No. Austin says, just busted to Shrek and Fiona's Shrek's tape. Okay. Fugo says, thoughts on Israel? It's a place. Jamal Dekrifa says, why did you private your old lives? No comment. Marvel says, you locked in? Yeah. Poppy says, where is your family? Somewhere. They're alive. National says, are you okay? Yes, I am, thank you. Dirt and Deliverance says, say no. Okay. Echo says, you look like a Trump supporter. Maybe, maybe not. Itchy Foreskin says, if you could have sex with your dream girl. No comment. Zaza says, what kind of antivirus? You have to endure this madness? What? I Love Fried Chicken says, why do you look like you're going to cry? My personality. Brian says, do you pinch and roll your ball sack? No. Siphon says, do you know a toot is a butt fart that probably stinks? Okay, ew. Phantom says, are you a vegan? No. Donut says, do you have a brother or sister? Maybe. Daniel says, I am the god of hellfire. Okay. Jazzy says, it's my birthday today. Happy birthday, Jazzy. Eric says, would you please call me Stomp? I'll try to. Poppy says, are you depressed? No. Ehe says, Don, do you remember me? I do. Timu says, my mom's bed is making squeaky sounds. Okay. Brian says, do you like Zelda games? I haven't played them. Dylan says, do you believe in God? No. Marvel Cuphead says, you happy and smile more? I should do that. Maybe. Cat Lewis says, yes. Okay. Nando says, are you gonna cop GTA 6? No. Raphael says, does your penis curve to the left or curve to the right? No comment. DT says, are you gay? I'm not gay. Father-son diecast says, why do we drive on parkways and park on driveways? That's a good question. Red says, what you doing if 5 nukes go off 1 inch from your face? Disintegrate. Colin says, do you hate my name? No, I don't. Roman King says, Don, will you save us from 3-Eye Atlas? What is 3-Eye Atlas? People keep on saying that, and I don't know. Russ says, 80085. Okay. Jorge says, what is your favorite food? The Big Mac. Stomp says, he drinks. He is human. I am human. Jamal Dekrifa says, my Hispanic Latino king. When can we have a Chick-fil-A meetup? Never. Zaza says, are we annoying for thinking you are not okay? A little bit. Beast Hunter says, do you play piano? I used to, Tiny. Dylan says, what happens when we die? Nobody knows. Mayan says, do the 6-7 gesture? No. Crick says, what's your local time? I'm not going to say, but it is nighttime. Grady says, say no to Don's butt plug. What? Down with the System says, are you an atheist? I guess so. Dark Blue says, can you try to smile? No. Nando says, would you clap a big booty Latina? No comment. Russ says, he's not gay if he likes 80085. I don't know what that is. Yazdan says, is it bad to drink tap water? I don't know. Rafael says, Charlie Kirk is pissed and confused as fuck right now in Valhalla. Okay. Hey, it's Ava says, can you sing to us? No. Dylan says, are you afraid of death? A moderate amount, yeah. Vixen says, how old are you? An adult. Aura says, 80085 is boobs. Huh, okay. Zaza says, is the world doomed? It's always has been. Ton says, would you let Diddy oil you up himself and clap them cheeks? No. Luke Wright says, Don must be at least 22. Maybe. Vex says, I love candy corn. Okay. Lovely Girl says, hello. Hello, Lovely Girl. Zaza says, do we still have hope? Yes. Manuel says, who's the better actor, DiCaprio or Brad Pitt? DiCaprio. Thrift and Things says, can you slow down the chat? That might be a good idea. I think it's kind of fun though when it just is like insane. Colin says, do you leave nice comments on YouTube or mean? To be honest, I've generally left more hate comments than nice comments. Cowboy says, ban Jixin. Maybe. Dirt and Deliverance says, why do vegans even use lawnmowers? The King says, you look like Michael Myers. Okay. The Virtual says, this dude gonna be on news one day. Peace. I hope for good things. I think for good things. Number says, you look like a Adderall. Okay. Down with the System says, what do you hate the most? Passing gas, sexual assault, murder. Blorgus says, is there a reason to keep going? Yeah. Family members. Barry McCockner says, shout me out. Well, I said your name, that's what you wanted, right? David says, WTF, okay. Mo says, Timu Edward Cullen, okay. Ehe says, croissant, okay. Zachary says, bro, I swear you blocked me the other day. Maybe YouTube was censoring your comments. Poppy says, are you locking in if you poop? I don't know what that means exactly. Brad says, can you make me mod? I swear I'll help with the spam. I don't need a mod. I kind of like the spam, to be honest. I like how fast it goes. It's. Brian says, do you ever believe in God? Never in my life. Malachi says, does it hurt when you pee? No. Number says, you look like a Adderall kid. Okay. Beetroot says, you're so cutie patootie. Okay. Brad says, good for you. Honestly, have fun. Thank you. Israel says, your shoulders are too close. I haven't been told that before. Zaza says, for us strangers, do you? What? YouTuber says, I'm from MS13. We watch you? Okay. Don't kill me, please. Don't rip off my face. Zachary says, are you just aura farming on us? No. Mello says, okay. World of the Lord God says, your right shoulder is shorter than your left. That's weird. Okay. Loki says, do you like big tortas? No comment. Poppy says, do you want to be famous one day? I think so. Random says, edging or gooning. Isn't that the same thing? Itchy Foreskin says, Don, I just heard a door shut. Who else is there? No comment. Nando says, can he beat Goku though? No. I like cat, says Daddy. Okay. Felix says, you look like Goku from the live action movie. Okay. Roman King says, Don, who hurt you in your past life? I don't believe in past lives. Ton says, can you say goodnight, I love you to me? No. Barry McCockner says, do you wipe back to front or front to back? I can't recall, I don't remember. Aura Underground says, when do you realize you were straight? I just always have been. Johan says, do you make money on this? I don't. Colin says, do you give your dog unlimited food? Do I even have a dog? Yazdan says, I summoned a lemon help. What? I like cats says, what time is it? Nighttime. Rafael says, I throw water on people over the bathroom stall because they can't escape in time to catch me. Cool. Bozapi says, would you come to my basement? No. Rise and Fire says, I miss you, bro. My fingers still smell from last night. I've never had sexual relations with you. Taraku says, do you realize how great you really are? These people are just jealous. I don't know about that. Poppy says, I'm not a photographer, but I can picture us together. W Riz. Okay. Barry says, get some water soon. Israel Short says, do you sit with your legs crossed? Yes.
Okay, I found this on the web for Israel Schwartz says, do you sit your legs crossed? Check it out.
1 second. Brian says, my wife is snoring. Okay. Old School says, do you believe in angels? No. Israel Short says, laughing my ass off. Okay. Phantom says, what's the temp there? I'm not gonna say. Reginald Foreman says, penis emoji, water emoji. Okay. Dylan says, what conspiracy do you truly believe? That everything's gonna be okay. Itchy Foreskin says he broke, laughing my ass off. I was just... Never mind. Dirt and Deliverance says, I remember what happened tomorrow. Tomorrow hasn't happened yet. Anita says, what triggered your lovely smile? I guess you guys didn't hear it. I Like Cats says, do you live in USA? Maybe. Loki says, do you like big tortas? Sure. Tina says, my husband is snoring. Okay. Luke says, I know what you did last summer. Okay. Russ says, do you know about Friendly Jordies his house got firebombed by someone in the Australian government. I do not know about that. Crazy. Rafael says Edward Cullen's schizophrenic little brother. Okay. MHY says I'm snoring. Okay. Israel Shorts says, do you purposely comb your hair like that? No. Poppy says, do you eat turtles? I don't. Brian says, this is weird, but I like it. I'm glad you like it. Mayan says, can you fix my TV? I live in North Pole. No. That guy says, how old are you? I'm an adult. Shadowmaster says, oh, now brown cow. Okay. Dirt and Deliverance says, I remember what happened tomorrow. That doesn't make any sense at all. That doesn't make sense. Dylan says, what conspiracy theory do you truly believe? No comment. Yazdan says, is it bad if I eat a bar of soap? Yes. Luke Schmidt says, big foot. Okay. Red says, are you supposed to pull back the skin when urinating? Yes. Barry McCockner says, what is your addiction? YouTube videos. Israel Short says, do you use wipes? What? Johan says, you are cool, fuck the haters, stay strong. Thank you. AZ Macaroni says, who are you? Thinking emoji. My name is Don Benitez. Forbes says, do trees bark? No. Brian says, do you like Stranger Things? I enjoyed watching the first season about a decade ago. J-Day says, Don, that's a cute name. Thank you. Mayan says, you should improve your relations on chat, bro. You just feel too mature, Unc. I don't know what you mean. Steven says, are you a jinn or not? Like a divine entity? What do you mean? Jaranus says, are you usually irritated when you stream? Am I usually like this when I stream? Yes. J-Day says, Don had that aura to him. Okay. Kona says, do you know that the Democrats are the devil? No comment. Mark says, when will Andromeda Galaxy reach out Galaxy? In millions of years. Israel Short says, are you a male? Yes. The guitarist says, do you like stepmoms? Sure. Roman King says, hey Alexa, play Ram Ranch. I don't have an Alexa, thankfully. Barry McCockner says, do you always wear two shirts? Not always. Yazdan says, do you go outside? Yes. Killian says, is this a social experiment? I guess so. Dylan says, was 9/11 an inside job? I believe in the mainstream media, so no. Phantom says, say, what? Nando says, what do you motorboat Sydney Sweeney? No. Daniel says, are you anatomically correct? Generally. Mayan says, man, a 17-year-old cricketer just died. That's sad. Avery says, start digging in your butt, twin? No. David says, are you gay? No. Yazdan says, can you say W speed? No, but I will be drinking water soon. David says, are you gay? No. Luke says, I play with my freaking poop. Gross. Thriftin' Things says, thank you for last night, Don. I had an amazing time tickling your cheeks. I don't know you. Brian says, what talent do you have? Video editing. Yazdan says, my pet got run over. Strawberry emoji. Okay. Dirt and Deliverance says, can Can you do an impression of yourself? No. Dylan says, in a relationship, I'm not. Kevin says, do you eat ass? No. Rob E says, how far do you commute? No comment. Zach says, content? What? David says, I only asked because you said no to Sweeney. I don't know what you're talking about. Avery says, what do you do for work? No comment. Yazdan says, Gary is missing. I hope he comes home. Callan says, do you wear panties? No. Gotham says, is the skunk ape in your walls? I don't believe in cryptids. Darkness says, are you cracked at Fortnite? I was in 2018. Thrift and Things says, have you ever taken Viagra? No. Israel Schwartz says, do you shave? Yeah. Taz says, 6'7", okay. Stomp says, can we watch you drink water? Sure, later. Down with the System says, do you drink? Maybe. Phantom says, do you take any medications? No comment. Darkness says, do you still play video games? I play Minecraft occasionally. Packin says, do you live with your parents? No comment. Roman says, are you allergic to toothpaste? No. Bozapi says, he's definitely on Prozac. Okay. Talk says, do you goon? No. Dylan says, most interesting thing about you, I'm not gonna say. Luke says, Blumpkins? Okay. Thrift and Things says, how long is your foreskin? Not gonna say. Tell or ask me anything in the chat. Gotham says, do you like Blumpkins? It sounds gross, no. Kona says, the Muffin Man? Okay. Yazdan says, I'm allergic to Judge Spit. What? Rich says he does. Okay. Kappa says, new angle or mirrored video? Mirrored video. Bree says, he is just a normal guy. Yes. Gotham says, Munt spray. Nia? What? Talk to my S says, do you know what gooning is? Prolonged masturbation. Sean says, would you want to live forever? No. Yazdan says, do you watch cartoons still? No. David says, do you have a girlfriend? I don't. Jan says, how tall are you? 5'7". Rez says, okay. Mayan says, sorry, I meant you should improve your reactions on chat. You just feel too mature. I should be, like, more playful with you guys. Maybe in the future. Nando says, are you nice at Street Fighter? I'm not good at the game Street Fighter. Luke says, do you shave your legs? No. Mayan says, imagine there are 3 people and you alone. You winning or nah? No. Mafu says, the video is flipped. Your other eye was bulging last night. Yeah, the video is flipped. Dylan says, why do you avoid depth to your answers? So I can read more chats. Thrift and Things says, if there was an orangutan holding you, would you beat him off or push him off? I mean, I would just stay still and just hope that he leaves. Saya says, he's fine just the way he is, though. Okay. Bazapi says, can I explore your developing body? No. Rez says, Dawn is legitimately this emoji. Easter Island statue emoji. Okay. Poppy says, do you play PSP? PlayStation... I don't know what that is. Ken Doge says, WTF? Okay. Stomp says, can you ask Dylan who is in his profile picture? Dylan, who's in your profile picture? Hey, it's Ava says, how many countries have you been to? 2. Dirt and Deliverance says, what do you call a group of people of a specific race on a shed? Antique garden tools? Okay. Bree says, do you have a personality? Everyone has one. Forbes says, would you like one of my buckets of sardine paste that I keep in my trunk? No, thank you. Sean says, do you prefer pancakes or waffles? Pancakes. Gotham says, do you know the Munting Man? No. Mudneck says, I'm Sofa King Dumb. Okay. Antwan says, school had so many fine women. Okay. Nando says, do you listen to ASMR? No. Thriftin' Things says, do you own a Manscaped razor or do you keep it natural? No comment. Packin says, do you change your clothes? Yes. Bhagwan says, bro, I found you again. What's up? Just reading chat. Darkness says, do you listen to Chicago Drill? No. Donut says, I'm back. Welcome back, Donut. Brian says, what other type of content do you make? Just this. Joe Doyle says, what's up, buddy? Hello, Joe. Travel says, what is one hobby that you like? Video editing. Bazapi says, what did you say to my basement invitation? I said no. Luke says, your teeth are yellow. Okay. Mudneck says, I'm just kidding. I don't know what you're talking about. Jan says, what is your favorite color? Gray. Geronius says, could you beat up a kangaroo? Probably not. Dirt and Deliverance says, say of the one of the following words. No, okay, yes, okay. Yazdan says, what is a cum bag? A bag full of ejaculate, I guess. MHY says, why do you say no to his basement invitation? I'm afraid that he might kill me. Roman King says, when Zoloft takes physical form. What? Travelcado says, favorite movie? Eyes Wide Shut. Shadow Master says, chicken fingers or chicken nuggets? Chicken nuggets. Shadow says, chicken fingers or chicken nuggets? Chicken nuggets. Luke says, you're kind of slow. Maybe. Ambi says, are you sleepy? No. Pearl says, would it betray your barber? What? Rich says, Dino Nuggies or nothing. Okay. Shane V2 says, are you in a bad mood? No. Pool says, how often do you do chat reading live streams? Daily. MTB says, do not take life too seriously. You will never get out of it alive. Thanks for the advice. Gotham says, what's your favorite genre of music? I guess rock. Foco says, do you like cats? Sure. Brian says, you said you have video editing talent. do you make content using that talent? Most of the stuff I've made has just been for myself. Kona says, have you ever been to Hawaii? No. Jazz says, are you into absurdism? Maybe. I don't think so. Poppy says, favorite poop? Like, favorite shape or, like, how solid it is? I don't want to think about that. Elios says, do you know what FYB means? No. Nugget says, what country you in? A country in North America. Jay says, is Dawn is good? Am I good? Yes. Jan says, what car do you drive? I'm gonna keep that private. Rafael says, favorite bag of chips? Lay's potato chips. Pulley says, what's your profile picture? It's a selfie of me, but I'm blackened out. Roman King says, big booty Latina or rainbow flags? No comment. Typhoon says, piss off. You piss off. MTB says, what's another world for thesaurus? I don't know. Stomp says, you drink water like Jimmy Fallon. Interesting. Saya says, oatmeal. Okay. Tiger Rebellion says, what did you eat today? A Big Mac. Saya says, have you drank eggnog? No. Mud Neck says, I was joking about the I'm so fucking dumb. Okay. Pearl says, have you ever peed in a pool? Yes. Iana says, I'm back. Hello, Iana. I noticed the only thing you say is like, I'm back. Jan says, give me one advice. Don't give up. Nugget says, ever been to England? No. Rich says, bot. Okay. Bree says, I'm back. Okay. Elios says, FYB means feeling your best. Are you feeling your best? Yes. MTB says, no man has a good enough memory to be a successful liar. Interesting. Micah says, do you support the Austrian painter? Hell no. Dirt and Deliverance says, every bag of chips is family-sized for an orphan. Okay. Stormy Weather says, do you like summertime? Yeah. Mystical Misfit says, what do you think of D's? What's D's? Roman King says, do you stream on Twitch? No. Gotham says, do you play video games? Yeah, Minecraft. Zen Gabriel says, yo, are you streaming daily? Yes. Ron says, have you ever measured the distance between your eyes before? No. Father Son says, when you clip paper, are you putting it together or taking it apart? Putting it together. Nando says, you ever punch someone in the shit? No. Elio says, do you know what PAB means? No. Hit 'em up K says, what kind of chair are you sitting in? A Secret Lab gaming chair, which I regret buying. Poppy says, are you having a good time, bro? Yes. Bhagwan says, yo, bro, I want to share some of my happiness with you. Looks like you need it. Okay. Marco says, do you like chorizo? No. Stomp says, I've been watching you so much, I'm starting to be able to answer most of these questions for you. Sorry if that makes things boring. Iana says, do you know me? Yes. Parasocially. Mystical Misfit says, ever sit on your balls? No. Jay says, OMG, no chorizo? Okay. PR says, you are autistic. This is not a question. Okay. Mr. Hands says, I will goon later. Okay. Leo says, do you know Mia Khalifa? Yeah, that's a porn star. Pearl says, do you like streaming on YouTube? Yes. Cap says, am I muted, chat? You're not. Stomp says, no, it's not boring. Glad to hear. Triple says, I love porn stars. Okay. Thriftin' Thing says, do you pee standing up? Yes. The Basement Dweller Show says, read this. There you go. Elios says, PAB means perfect, amazing, brilliant. Okay. Broken Beautifully says, hey, baby boo, look at you. You shine like a star. Okay. Doe says, are you unemployed? Maybe. Yazdan says, who is Sir Wilkins Bunker the Sixth? I don't know. LX says, I hate you. Okay. Iana says, drink water soon. RIP says, have you ever ate a cold piece of pizza? Yes. Cap says, have you met Quandale Dingle? No. Jazz says, all the best, Bretta. Thank you, Jazz. Mo Lester says, hey man, have you got them photos? No, wrong person. Little Hot Pocket says, do you like food? Yes. Iana says, bye Don. Bye, Iana. Mr. Hands says, do you like children? Not romantically. We Walk with King says, you read so slowly. Sorry. Ollie says, does your starfish blow kisses? What? I don't want to know what that means. Yazdan says, we found Gary. Glad to hear. Elio says, are you PAB? I don't know. Stomp says, when was the last time you tripped and fell? It must have been years. Gotham says, what makes you smile? Funny things. Cap says, bro eats a Big Mac every day. No wonder his brain is fried. Okay. Jason says, short urinal? Yeah. LX says, really, after all the comments I've left, that's the one you read? For fuck's sake, I don't hate you, I love you. Okay. Yazdan says, do you use spoons? Yes. Nando says, do you speak a different language, Unc? No. Justin Powers says, are you AI? No. Leo says, do you know Gamma Jack? No. Pearl says, why did you regret buying your gaming lab secret chair? Because gaming chairs are pretentious. Waste of money. Dirt and Deliverance says, funny things. That's not how it works. Gotham says, why don't people use sporks anymore? They combine both the power of a fork and a spoon. I don't know. Tritty says, do you stand and wipe? No. Thriftin' Things says, I have $1 million hidden in my basement. Can you come help me find it? No. Gotham says, do you like sporks? No. Somac says, which burger do you like most on? The Big Mac cheeseburgers. Jan says, is your brother Harry Maguire? What? Rich says 6'7". Okay. Brian says, degenerate things. Thanks for the common comment. Luxury says, if you woke up tomorrow and realized that nobody remembered you, would you still be the same person? Well, I definitely would change a lot, I think. Poppy says, what is a neighbor? Someone that lives next to you. Leo says, do you have a girlfriend? No. Stomp says, Dylan, it's a Big Mac, for fuck's sake. His favorite food is Big Mac. Yeah. Girth says, I threw up on my cat. Ew, I hope you're cleaning him up right now. Bree says, this autism shit is too bland. There is nothing entertaining about this. Sorry, Don Benitez. Okay. Brian says, you're definitely a eunuch. Okay. Darkness says, have you ever watched Goblin on YouTube? No. Yuli says, what's your go-to game? Minecraft. It used to be Rainbow Six Siege. Emily says, are you like this in real life? I'm a bit more expressive in real life. Thriftin' Thing says, how big are you flaccid? No comment. Travelcado says, you remind me of a Twilight vampire, which is cool. Okay. Fading Star says, say 6'7" 3 times. No. Jomar says, do you remember me? I remember your name. Luxury says, what if you have no personality at all? I don't know. Dirt and Deliverance says, what starts with a N and ends with a R? Neighbor? Okay. Caleb says, messages, Christina. What? Cookie Game says, do you remember me? No. Art with Personality says, my grandma died. Him? Okay. If someone says that, I would say sorry, not okay. Jan says, what is your goal in life? Win in a steering contest. Godzilla. Justin Power says, your lives are the best at really getting to know the creator. Okay. Rich says, birds aren't real. They are real. Bree says, you look like a fucking bot. Okay. PE says, last memorable dream. I had a dream in my most recent sleep that I was on a train and there were people coming aboard and trying to kill us, like people on horses, like Wild West. Yazdan says, don't eat apple C's. Okay. Uli says, mac and cheese or grilled cheese sandwich. Mac and cheese. Broman says, if God existed, would you just say okay? No. Vex says, Pepe's. Okay. Justin says, what was the finest job you've had? I'm not gonna say. Stifton Thing says, can you come find the pot of gold with me at the end of the rainbow? That's fake, fictional. Darkness says, tell everyone I'd shit on them in Fortnite. I don't know that for sure. Graybox says, hi, remember me? I remember your name. Pearl says, so you bought that chair because it looked cool? Yes. Mr. Hand says, come find what? Captain Blackbeard says, bro, if you're gonna start dressing the same each day, I'm gonna consider you a cartoon character. Okay. So Max says, have you tried filet of fish? No. Should I try it? MTB says, Q, what do computers eat? Microchips. Funny. Thriftin' Thing says, can I kiss your beautiful lips? No. Justin Powers says, are you Japanese? No. Stomp says, in your dream, were you on the train with someone you knew or alone? People I knew. Nando says, would you clap Steve Harvey with a wig on? No. Real Time Rock says, do you ever change? Why the same outfit? Because I get real attached to one outfit and I don't want to change. Fading Star says, can you do a backflip? No, that's a different streamer. Caleb says, how old are you? An adult. Megan Me says, are you okay? Yes. Atlan says, hello. Hello. PE says, so very autist. It's an autistic thing to wear the same thing every day. Okay. Pearl says, if Gray was a person, it would be you. Okay. Stomp says, this is his streaming uniform. Yeah. Atlan says, do you play Roblox? No. Megan Me says, how old are you? An adult, that's all I'm saying. Retroplank says, are you live? Yes, this is not pre-recorded. Dylan says, are you diagnosed with anything? Not that I know of. Christina says, just an average guy. Okay. Jorge says, you tryna smoke a bowl of crack with my homeless neighbor? No. Darkness says, are you secretly a lizard? No. EJ says, I also sleep in my clothes? Okay. LX says, 420 blaze it? Okay. Darkness says, laughing my ass off? Okay. Gotham says, do you like manga or comics? Neither. Peter says, you're pretty fly for a white guy. Okay. Atlan says, I feel like you would literally be acting like it is a normal Sunday when the building's on fire. No, I would be freaked out. Cap says, who is NBA GOAT? LeBron. To be honest, I just chose at random because I don't watch sports. Somax says, do you like pizza? Yeah, pepperoni. Stomp says, it would be funny if most of the things in your room were gray. Okay, I don't want that though. LX says, my ass itches. Okay. We Walk with King says, Don looks like he doesn't listen to any music at all, and his favorite color is gray. Okay. Davidicus says, what are your hobbies? Watching YouTube videos. Roman says, if Lizzo barrel rolled on your pelvis, will you just say okay? No, I'd probably yell, get off me. Jigga says, lizard man? Okay. Cat says, for what? What? Rich says, what kind of hobby is that? A young adult, young person hobby. Travelcado says, religious? No. LX says, I bet you're on the FBI's watch list. Okay. Jacob says, when did you get hit hard by autism? Aren't you born with it? Fading Star says, get some sleep or something. I will eventually. Dante says, check his hard drive. I don't have anything illegal on it. Jigga Manog says, he's related to the Zuck. No. LX says, weren't you on America's Most Wanted? Nope. Nando says, not gonna lie, you're cooked, buddy. Okay. David says, I can't lie, man. You look like you ate some mushrooms and started streaming. Not an insult. Okay. Cap says, room. Room. Okay. Stomp says, do you just say okay after an orgasm? No. The Screaming Lamb says, when are you gonna stream with Dixon Myers? You wanted me to say dicks in my ass? There you go. Darkness says, Mark, give me the Zuck. Okay. Gotham says, what's your biggest phobia? I don't think I have a phobia. Roman says, if Lizzo barrel rolled on your pelvis, will you just say okay? No. Moonlight says, so you believe in second chance? What? Donald says, why are you scared? I'm not scared. Jan says, you're driving and saw two people. One old person and the other is a kid. What do you hit first? I don't want to think about that. That's painful to think about. Gotham says, is Lizzo a deity? No. Justin Powers says, what kind of personality would you say you are? I don't know the INTJP personality stuff. I don't know that stuff. Oli says, hit the brakes. Yes, that's what I would do. Jigga says, hurts the lizard brain to think of scenarios. Yes, I'm not that advanced yet. Rajat says, do you think Nicki Minaj and Cardi B has great music? I mean, when I hear it in like supermarkets, my brain finds it pleasurable. BMO says, start digging in your butt, twin. No. Mr. Hand says, do you come in Dubai? No. Token says, 420 blaze it. Okay. Pearl says, a human pigeon. Okay. El Capo says, how long have you been answering questions today? An hour. James says, hey, you're still at it. Yes. Otto says, oil up. No. Borrowed Time says, nice hair. Thank you. Roman King says, if we opened your laptop, will your password be okay? No, that's way too insecure. Jaguar says, dude. Okay. Travelcado says, your favorite YouTube channels? Salcy1. Nando says, equal rights should not be a thing. They should be. MTB says, can I ask you a serious question? Are you sitting in a cardboard box? No, it's just the angle. We Walk with King says, do you do these live streams to build confidence with social interactions? That might be a factor. Shapeshifting says, I got a spare pizza slice. Want it, babe? Yeah, but that's impossible. El Capo says, how much money have you made? 0. Gon says, my amigo is back. Hello, Gon. Jan says, we need him to get a Big Mac for upgrade. What? Yazdan says, Jew. What? Travelcado says, favorite subject in school? History. Gotham says, what's a store you would choose to be trapped in during a zombie apocalypse? A supermarket. Roman King says, equal rights, equal lefts. What? Captain 1 says, Big Mac eating video. Never. Ditto says, do you blink, robot? I hope I'm blinking. Garcia says, when you planning on coming out? Never. Pearl says, when are you gonna make videos? Possibly never. Rich says, women shouldn't be cops. Okay. Vixen says, are you hung? No comment. Rajat says, get 15 McNuggets and do a mukbang. I hate when people eat on camera. Aura says, do you like turtles? Sure. Lady says, hello all you beautiful people. Hello. BMO says, can you tell my dad to come home? No. Cap says, favorite car? Not into cars. Yashvi says, hi. Hello, Yash. Davidish says, what's your favorite video game? Red Dead Redemption 1. Yazdan says, www speed. Okay. Stomp says, are you stuck on manual blinking mode? That might be the case. Travel says, favorite period in history? American Civil War. Dylan says, insecurity. What? MFK says, where are you from? North America. Pearl says, you only like streaming then? Basically. Pineapple says, no, so nonchalant. Okay. Mr. Hand says, show us the fan. No. Forzia says, nothing matters but your deeds. Interesting. Jorge says, you wouldn't be scared if a hobo forced you to smoke a bowl of crack at gunpoint? I would be scared. Darkness says, would you go to a Diddy party if invited? No. Rajat says, will you prank call Walmart? No. The Synth Wizard says, you sound a little hoarse. Are you sick, Don? Possibly. I noticed that too. LX says, Don is a psyop for the CIA. No, I'm not. MTB says, I subscribe to you. Okay. Gotham says, I'm sitting here at 4:10 a.m. when I need to be awake in 4 hours, and I don't regret it. I think you should go to sleep. Maya says, what's the time on your watch? Not gonna say. Kevin says, would you vote wood chipper? What? Roman says, are you secretly based? No. Mr. Hand says, your lips look pink. Heart emoji. Okay. Shapeshifting says, shapeshifting sent a virtual pizza slice through Super Chat. I wish that was a thing. Justin Powers says, do you have a college degree? No. Jan says, Don, you need some rest? Okay, I don't. Gotham says, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? I don't know. Stomp says, he doesn't even have Super Chat activated. I don't. Jazz says, hi. Hello, Jazz. Yazdan says, remember me from last stream? I remember your name. Shapeshifting says, you are no fun. Okay. LX says, Don did 9/11. No, I didn't. Timu says, do you have pink eye? I don't think so. Forzia says, be careful who you surround yourself with. It rubs off on you. Yeah, I've heard that advice before. Thanks. Gotham says, do you do this planning on earning revenue eventually? Or is this just for your own fun's sake? Both. Travelcado says, do you collect anything? No. It's me, Bub says, I'm here every day. Welcome, it's me, Bub. Dylan says, butt or breasts? No preference. Rich says, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Okay. Marga says, 126354111. Okay. Timu says, your eyes look AI. Okay. Gon says, do you like pickles? Yes. Mr. Hand says, do you wipe forward or backward? I can't remember. Travelcado says, favorite book? Wisdom of Life by Schopenhauer. Vixen says, can you say something in Spanish? Hola. Jay says, I want to see you smirk, please. You're gonna have to wait. Pulley says, he forgot to wipe. That's not what I meant. Gotham says, are you playing Battlefield 6 recently? No. Rajat says, got mods in the channel? No. It's me, Bub says, did you know that your favorite animal, chimpanzee, they're your favorite animal because they are similar to humans? Of course I knew that. Forzia says, do we wink? No. Muffin says, Jesus loves you. Okay. Darkness says, did you play the OG Call of Duties like Black Ops 2? Yes. Forzia says, wink for us? No. Roman says, why are your shoulders missing? They're not missing. Timu says, do you like mustard? Yes. Pearl says, earlier you looked like you wanted to burp. That happens. The Synth Wizard says, are you planning on doing anything besides this while streaming? No. Gotham says, Battlefield or Call of Duty? Uh, Call of Duty. Dylan says, played Guitar Hero? No. BMO says, bro, it's late. Go to sleep. No. Shapeshifting says, where do you breathe from? I think generally from my nostrils. Jan says, Iana is back on. She is. Welcome back, Iana. Ban says, do you know Teto? No. Mr. Hand says, chimpanzees can't swim. Okay. Nando says, would you rather fight a tiger or a bear? A tiger. Wheeler says, favorite chipmunk? Alvin. Iana says, no way, people, no way, Ham. You have a fan base now. Pearl says, what's chipmunk? Alvin and the Chipmunks. Davidicus says, what game are you currently playing through? Just Minecraft. Rajat says, are you a Sabrina Carpenter and Swifty? No. Trap and Trace says, picking your ethnicity is like picking a bear's nose. Impossible. Okay. Ban says, do you know Miku? Yeah, that anime robot singing girl, yeah. Travelcado says, philosophy on life. The only thing I know for certain is that I know nothing. Daniel says, how you doing? Good, thank you. Kat says, Kim bros. What? BMO says, what console do you play on? I play on PC, but back in the day, PS4. Jan says, what is your favorite sport? Basketball. Wheeler says, would you enter a belly flop contest? No. Jan says, what is your favorite sport? Basketball. Chris says, Donald Trump is the greatest president. Okay. Pearl says, which ride you like in amusement park? The California Adventure ride that goes in a loop. That's good. Stomp says, you might stand a chance by yelling and scaring a bear. No chance against a tiger. Yeah, but I was assuming the question was saying that, like, I had to fight. I couldn't, like, run away. Boxing Boy says, do you like yellow walls? No. Fisher says, you gay? I'm not. Keith says, is Mars habitable? I don't know. Mr. Hand says, chimpanzee facts reveal that they are one of the most intelligent animals in the world. Okay. Darkness says, where you cracked at Call of Duty back in your days? I was not. I was a very casual gamer. Zach says no. Okay. Dylan says heaven or hell? Heaven. Jan9 says hi. Hello, Jan9. Yazdan says okay. Roman King says, if you had a chance at respawning, where would it be and why? Somewhere in the United States. Mr. Hand says, chimpanzee facts state that they can live to 50 years in the wild. Thank you. I don't know these facts, and I'm enjoying them. Ban says, laughing my ass off. Okay. Nando says, what do you clap? Hillary Clinton oiled up? No. Pink says, are you excited for the new Avengers Doomsday next year? I want to say no, but in reality, I think my brain, it's yes. Darkness says, I would. Okay. Fisher says, are you racist? No. Fazia says, what's your favorite color? Gray. Moon says, are you femboy? No. Jan says, what is your favorite music? Rock. Iana says, E. Okay. Phantom says, did you change clothes just now? No. Fisher says, how big is it? No comment. Davidicus says, what's your favorite show? Breaking Bad. Fisher says, what color is green? Green. Thriftin' Things says, what's your address? No comment. Zach says, what's your superpower? I don't know. Iana says, shout out to LX. Okay. Stock says, do you have autism? No. Gotham says, do you like Java or Bedrock? Java. Dylan says, ramen or pho? Or ramen. Davidicus says, yeah, you're valid. Okay. Mr. Hand says, chimpanzee facts mention that they sleep in tree nests made of leaves and branches. Interesting. Carson says, bro, shut the fuck, please. No. Thunderstorm says, hello. Hello, Thunderstorm. Stomp says, comfortable telling us your favorite basketball team? I don't really have one. Timu says, crying emoji. Game over emoji. Crying emoji. Okay. Shapeshifting says, say the alphabet. No. Mr. Wolf says, favorite hair gel. Fiber cream. Jan says, do you carry a gun? No. LX says, Don killed JFK. That's false information. Gotham says, based Java user. Do you play modded or vanilla? Vanilla usually. Fisher says, taco sauce. Okay. Elliot says, fascism or nah? Nah. Nando says, do you think low tier god should take care of his daughter? I don't really know the situation, but yeah. Stargazer says, I subscribed. Okay. Gotham says, blood had to think about it. Okay. Wheeler says, do you like fried mahu with boto sauce? I don't know what that is. Mr. Hand says, chimpanzee facts tell us that they can use tools like sticks and stones to find food. Wow. Timu says, a bunch of stupid emojis. Okay. Pearl says, what false accusations you ever got? I don't want to say. Roman says, only one gets to exist, cats or dogs. Dogs, because I think they brought more joy to humans. Tustra says, whisker biscuit. Okay. Thriftin' Things says, chimpanzee facts. Okay. Darkness says, do you know about Jeffy? Jeffy who? Fisher says, where do you work? That's private. Fosia says, do you like spaghetti? No. Fading Star says, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Shapeshifting says, my pet chimp is watching this. Am I doing a good thing? It's neither good or bad, I think. Phantom says, do you have any allergy? Yes. Jan says, can you make a joke, please? No. The sickly one says, do you have any pets? No. Thunderstorm says, do you get freaky at night? No comment. The Myth says, lock in twin. Okay. Pearl says, do you play online games? Yes. Brad says, do you shave, wax, or leave your pubic hair? No comment. Mr. Hand says, chimpanzee facts explain that grooming helps them build strong friendships. Okay. Ishneen says, are you Asian? No. Fading Star says, should I subscribe? If you want to. The sickly one says, what's your allergy? Not gonna say. Shapeshifting says, chimpanzee facts, they touch themselves. Do they? I don't know. Rajat says, favorite Philippine city? I don't know Philippine cities, sorry. Midnight says, you make my dick hard? Okay. Dylan says, plan on switching up this stream theme? Not anytime soon. Talking Tuna says, you're going faster today? I'm talking faster? Okay. Chill Dude says, question mark? Okay. Timu says, bunny, lick me at night on my couch. Ew. Johan says, pineapple or pen? Pen. Garcia says, what's your favorite band? This will determine if you're gay or not. Arcade Fire. Switch It Up says, you sound like a programmed robot. I do. Pretty Boy says, hi, did you come today? No comment. Thunderstorm says, do you goon? No. Chunky Sweats, let's goon together back to back? No. Pearl says, what's your favorite job? I don't have one. LX says, Metallica or Megadeth? Metallica. Stomp says, I noticed it too. You're reading and answering faster. Are you eager to end the stream? No. Rajat says, like Java chip. What? Iana says, Monomatramoscopics livaconvolanoconiosis. Okay. Switch It Up says, what do you like to do besides live? Watch YouTube videos. Darkness says, do you play Clash Royale or Clash of Clans? Neither, but I've played both in the past. Rich says, finally. Okay. Jay says, finally, I got to see his smirk. Okay. Garcia says, Arcade Fire, you definitely like boys. Okay. Fisher says, should I brush my teeth? Yes. The Synth Wizard says, you've ignored my last 20 messages, Dom. Maybe YouTube is censoring them. Osama says, hey. Hello, Osama. Pink says, did you watch the new Demon Slayer movie? No. Shapeshifting says, chimpanzee facts. When killed, they die usually. I believe in that. Fazia says, do you like cookies and milk? No. Roman King says, one must go. Vagisil or hemorrhoid cream? Hemorrhoid cream. Gotham says, a night with Jennifer Lopez or a meal cooked with Gordon Ramsay? A meal cooked with Gordon Ramsay. Fazia says, do you like meatballs? No. Larry the King says, can you make the comments slow? It's annoying. Should I make it where you can only send comments every 10 seconds? Captain 1 says, I'm going to bed. Good night, Donnie Boy. Good night, Captain 1. Iana says yes. Okay, maybe I will. The Synth Wizard says yes. Okay. Chunky Sweats, can I hit it? Can I beat it with my sword? What? Rich says no. I kind of like the chaos of, a fast chat. Moondog says, bro, my ass is musty. Okay. Roman King says, no, don't cuck. Okay. Rainy Days, how do I know you're real? I guess you don't. Thrift and Things says, are you straight or play for the other team? I'm straight. Nando says, should I swallow this honey pack and beat my shit? No. Thrift and Things says, I already read that. Jacqueline says, you have a very nice smile. Okay. Zach says, cause he answers in real time. Okay. The Synth Wizard says, there are so many spammers, bro. Yeah, that's the best reason to put on slow mode. Shapeshifting says, chimpanzee facts. Baby chimps sleep when tired after playing. Okay. Stomp says, whoa, that light change tripped me out. Yeah, it tripped me out too, but I was pretending like it didn't. Jan says, do you pay the bill? I saw the light went out for a second. Yes. Hi says, can I put baby oil on you? No. Rajat says, hello bro, do you think Rihanna and J-Lo is beautiful? Sure. Phantom says, do you take any antidepressants or anxiolytics ever? No comment. Rich says, how many glizzies can you eat? I don't eat hot dogs. Mr. Han says, chimpanzee facts show that they share about 98 to 99% of their DNA with humans. Game over emoji. Okay. Bree says, how old are you? I'm an adult. Why are you still here, Bree? He says, do you evade taxes? No. Shapeshifting says, chimpanzee facts. They sometimes eat things. Okay. Stomp says, maybe try slow mode for 5 minutes and then switch back just to test it. I have tested it. I think I like slow mode off. Selena says A. Okay. Create content says, have you ever had a dream where, like, your dream... Jordan says the other angle was better, to be honest. This is the same angle, but just mirrored. Wheeler says, did he know that Spaghetti O's took 15 tries to get correct? Wow, I did not know that. Redacted user says, this guy has no sense of humor. So boring. Mr. Boring Businessman. Okay. Iana says, guess what country I'm from? United States. Chunky Sweat says, let me rub some sherm on you. What? EJ says, favorite movie? Eyes Wide Shut. Stock says, chimpanzee facts. They really like laying around and then eating something. Okay. Trafford says, shut up please. No. Phantom says, these hyperactive shut holes piss me off. He ain't boring, he's realistic. Okay. Roman says, one word must die forever. Okay or no? Okay. Dylan says, Eyes Wide Shut has lots of boobs. That's true. Chunky Sweat says, Eyes Wide Shut. Whoa, do we have a Stanley Kubrick fan? Yeah. Billy the Jet says, are you a clone of Don Benitez? No. Shapeshifting says, chimpanzee facts. Planet of the Apes is a documentary in 2055. Okay. Pearl says, Dawn, can you read my chat so I can go? Also, good night. Good night, Pearl. King says, was that your final answer? Yes. Joe says, oh, it's you again. Hello, Joe. Darkness says, would you run for president? No. He says, can you run for president? No. Jan says, please stop with these chimpanzee facts. I kinda like them. Phantom says, if he ran for president, I think people won't take it. They are so fragile. They don't like straight answers. Maybe. Tane says, the Cullens. Okay. Travelcado says, you are very polite. Thank you. LX says, these chimpanzee facts are killing me. Yeah, they're kind of funny. Chunky Sweat says, do you like Eyes Wide Shut because of the moral and philosophical implications? Yes. Vixen says, are you Hispanic? Yes. Mr. Hand says, elephant fact. Elephants are the only animals that cannot jump like your mother. Funny. Nando says, would you rather have werewolf or vampire powers? Werewolf powers? Gotham says, alright, I'm a bounce. Bye, Gotham. Adam says, laughing emoji. Okay. Pre-minus says, do you know GD? What's that? Byler says, Ratatouille. Okay. Stockak says, do you know what your IQ is? No. Pre-minus says, Geometry Dash. Okay. Dylan says, Eyes Wide Shut has a lot of boobs. Yes, it does. Jan says, I want history facts for Dawn. Sure, give me those. Wonder Bucket says, my buddy is half Japanese and half Native American. His name is Nissan Pathfinder. Okay. Mayan says, dance, you can't say no. What? Edit says, do you know racial slur? What? Mr. Hand says, kangaroo fact. Kangaroos cannot walk backward like your mother. Okay. Hey says, Skibbity Toilet facts. Did you know Skibbity Toilet is a Rizzler? No. Blah says, it's been like 5 hours. Not that long. Mayan says, your mom fact. Okay. Pre-minus says, do you know Roblox? Yes. Chunky Sweat says, can you give reasons as to why you like Eyes Wide Shut? I just like it, you know. The Synth Wizard says yawn emoji. Okay. Wheeler says some people say cucumbers taste better pickled. Okay. Darkness says cause of the boobs. Okay. LX says shape shifting is a gooner. Okay. Roman King says fun fact rabbit hearts are so weak they could die with the sound of slam doors. Did you? I guess you're into the like Emaru thing situation. TC says, how do you make your money? What job do I have? No comment. Blah says, I'm your biggest fan. Okay. Nando says, do your balls get musty from time to time? I don't know. Gon says, do you like Gabe Horn? No. Jan says, fun facts about rabbits. They can jump. Yes. Mystery comment says, if you keep a bottle of Coca-Cola on the desk, maybe they will sponsor you one day. They wouldn't, considering the insane things I read out. RM says, skip this comment if you're gay. I'm not gay. Yay. MK Seed says, buckets full of chopped up spam and pockets full of lima beans. Okay. Shapeshifting says, Don Benitez, facts. Favorite film, Eyes Wide Shut. That's true. The Synth Wizard says, what water brand is that? No comment. Bree says, you are gay totally. Okay. El Capo says, I can taste the autism in this one. It's strong. Okay. Johan says, you Sigma or Alpha? I don't know. TZ says, the no comment on the water killed me. Okay. Rajat says, do you play Wigcraft? I don't know what that is. Mystery comment says, Kirkland isn't a secret. Okay. Stomp says, Eyes Wide Shut had a lot of guys with boners in the theaters. That's definitely true. The Synth Wizard says, bro, why are you hiding your water? No comment. Rich says, fun fact, if you read this, you're gay. Okay. Gaming Midget says, look at the camera and say okay. Alright. Darkness says, damn Don, save some bitches for the rest of us. Okay. Cat says, TV emoji. Okay. Davidicus says, what day did you start streaming? September 2nd of this year. So Hale says, dude, you look pretentious. Okay. Rich says, gatekeeping water is crazy. Okay. Nando says a fun fact about dolphins. They are all Diddy's disciples. Okay. Darkness says, laughing my ass off. Okay. Mr. Hand says, sloth fact. Sloths move so slowly that green algae can grow on their fur like your mother. Okay. El Capo says, you have autistic hair. Interesting. LX says, okay. Okay. Andrew says, I'm coming for you. Okay. He says, shower thoughts. Clapping is just high-fiving yourself. Yes. Gaming Midget says, look at the camera and say, alright. Okay. Living Great says, hydrophobic. That's why he's hiding his water. In case his fans get triggered. No. Iana says, I'm back. Hello, Iana. Rich says, everyone say okay. 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 Blah says, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. Interesting. El Capo says, why are you lying about how much money you've made off this stream? I seriously haven't made any money. I'm not monetized yet. I want to be monetized. Bree says, say something else other than okay, wow. Alright. He says, shower thoughts. Does a straw have one hole or two holes? One hole. Michael says, how far do you squirt? I don't. Smoke says, are you circumcised? No comment. Mystery Comment says, he's hiding his water from David Blaine. What would he do with it? I don't remember. Blah says, you pray? No. Shape-shifting Sweetheart says, history facts. Court gestures were sometimes fondled. Okay. Jan says, you look like my history teacher, not gonna lie. Okay. Darkness says, I would love to smoke a blunt with you. Okay. He Locke says, shower thoughts. If you're waiting for the waiter, aren't you the waiter? Yeah, I guess so. You're a waiter too. Ochi says, who do you main in Team Fortress 2? I only played like half an hour of it. I think I played the spy. Grim says, interesting, wow, alright, okay. Okay. Faco says, Fort Collins, Colorado. Okay. Bree says, okay. Gon says, are you rich? No. Mojo says, looks like an Elliot Rodger fan. I'm not. I am not a supreme gentleman. Jazzy says, how do you feel knowing you're piloting a bone mech with meat armor? It's depressing. Bandito says, okay. Montana says, is Mr. Evil Mustache Man your ancestor? No. Rye says, I heard from your dad you like dick. That's false information. TZ says, answer Rich's question, please. The people want to know your truth. What? Timmy says, not a supreme gentleman. I'm not. Garcia says, there's a lot of us from Colorado in here. We know you're from Colorado. Maybe. Wonderbucket says, but if a straw had a hole, it wouldn't work. What? Rye says, I hear you fuck your mom. You, no. Athera says, you like black girls? Sure. ND says, are you Chinese? No. Shapeshifting says, Don Benitez, future facts. Still living, January 2nd, 2026, 4:40 a.m. PE says, this emoji? Okay. Cody says, hello, how are you doing today, brother? Good, thank you. The Synth Wizard says, unrelated, but I'm having shortness of breath, Don. If it's serious, call 911. Daisy says, what's your favorite music? Rock, I guess. Dylan says, does a straw have one or two holes? I think one. Floating Bus says, hello from Lanzas City. Okay. DX says, hello, I'm back. Hello, DX. Hi says, shower thoughts. Even when a balloon is half inflated, it is completely full. Okay. Volcano says, hello, I'm new, I am subscribing. Hello, Volcano. Athera says, how do you bury a body? With a shovel. Chunky Sweat says, do you listen to indie? Yeah. LX says, Don facts. Don is really a chimpanzee in a Don costume. Nope. Floating Bus says, Kansas City. You had a typo? Okay. Rajash says, hi, Burberry, what's going on? Hello. Smoke says, I got a headache, help me. I can't help you. Daisy says, what's your favorite food? The Big Mac. Jan says, we got Don Future Facts gang. Okay. Wonder Bucket says, if I fart, burp, and sneeze all at the same time, will I die? No. Mystery Comment says, let's all have a Big Mac with a Coke in honor of Don today, if you want. Hi Locke says, shower thoughts. I correct autocorrect more than it corrects me. Are you sure? I doubt that's true. Mr. Hand says, giraffe fact. Giraffes have the same number of neck bones as humans. 7. Interesting. EJ says Intel or AMD. Intel. Iana says shout out to shape-shifting sweetheart. Okay. Shape-shifting Sweetheart says Don Benitez Future Facts. Dead on March 24th, 2026, 12 p.m. Killed by a viewer. I hope that doesn't come true. Snorlodge says I ate a turtle once. Okay. Rich says name someone you'd suck a fart out of. I don't want to think about that. Jan says rest in peace, Don. Okay. Jan says rest in peace, Don. Yes. Like us, somewhat. Nando says you think Jeffrey Dahmer was kind of cooking? No. Darkness says you watch Rick and Morty? No. Dylan says what do you care about most? Family members. LX says hot take, Big Macs are mid. Okay. Garcia says you look like the type of guy to take tomatoes off your burger. I like tomatoes. Rajat says, do you think Toronto Blue Jay are going to get W? Yes. Hi Locke says, fun facts. Bean bags are just boneless sofas. Okay. Sigma says, why do you ignore Rich? I don't ignore anyone in particular. Gon says, do you think we're all cool? No. Andy says, cats or dogs? Dogs. Tricky says, you watch the World Series? No. Jazzy says, are tomatoes a fruit or vegetable botanically? Fruit. Chunky Sweat says, favorite backyardigan? Is there a cow one? I think the cow, if there is one. LeMay says, hi. Hello, LeMay. Rich says, bro has read too many of my comments. Okay. ND says, say the N-word? No. Roman says, Don, hypothetically, what's your last meal before lethal injection? An egg sandwich. Iana says, should I eat? Yes. Mystery Comment says, a Big Mac with quarter-pounder patties instead is worth trying. Maybe I should give that a try. Gon says, yeah, I can see it, Tricky. Okay. The Synth Wizard says, licking lips emoji. Okay. Chunky Sweat says, it's Wada time. Okay. Shape-shifting Sweetheart says, Don Benitez, future facts. Deported to South Africa workers camp on February 19th, 2026. Okay. Yaya says, if you were an alien, would you destroy the Earth? No. Kyran says, why do you seem so angry? I don't know. He says, fun facts, brushing our teeth is the closest we ever come to cleaning our skeleton. Okay. God's Kong says, are you depressed? Seems like it. No. Psylocke says, you look like a child abuser. Okay. EJ says, corn emoji. Okay. Cat says, are these queries the meaning of constellations? No. Oh, Cheese says, have you ever gone fishing? No. God's Kong says, well, that was convincing. Okay. Darkness says, have you heard the Brain Rot song? No. Danny says, wanna guck? What? Jazzy says, what is the meaning of the universe? It's unknowable. Athera says, bro says okay. Droopy eyes emoji. Okay. I'm gooning again says, do you own a gun? No. Ray says, Rey Mysterio donated $100. I wish that was real. Mr. Hand says, egg sandwich fact. Egg sandwiches are one of the most popular breakfast foods around the world. Okay. Montana says, oh, okay. Bree says, I hope I kind of have a serial killer type vibe. Okay. EJ says, do you like vulgar AI music mashups? I haven't listened to them. Dylan says, can't even donate. Yeah, I'm not monetized yet. LeMay says, how can I make you happy? I would say donate, but I am not monetized. The Synth Wizard says, donated 0.011 cent. Okay. ND says, you look like you smell like boiled eggs. I don't think so. Athera says, did you kill Kennedy? No. Jan says, it's time to drink water, Don. Yeah, I think it is very soon. Blink says, like women hurricanes are wet and wild, they take your wife and kids. Sad. Someone says, can't you put your Patreon or PayPal to get donations? That's really tacky, though. I don't think people would do that. CK says, have you ever done hard drugs? No. Wonder Bucket says, is the bottle full of vodka? No. Shapeshifting says, Don Benitez Future Facts, reincarnated on June 39th, 1933 in Jerusalem after assassination. Interesting. Blink says, why do tampons come with strings? So that you can floss after you're done eating? Okay. Tay says, why your teeth tinted green? I don't know. Hawktua says, shower thoughts. Which orange came first, the color or the fruit? The fruit. Mr. Hand says, like, share, and subscribe if you want to. Athera says, I saw you in Breaking Bad. You did? Don't tell me I'm the eating breakfast kid. Mystery Comment says, Dawn Future Facts. Dawn is the first one to get Hawktua from the Hawktua girl? No. Rich says, protect Dawn from Assad. I am Assad. Sahua says, if you remove money from the equation, what is the definition of success for you? I don't know. Goku says, do you love cats because I love them? No. Blah says, I'm high. Okay. Chunky Sweat says, Big Mac fact, they make people gay. Okay. Stockyak says, I fart under my blanket and then put my head under so I could smell it. That's very gross. Blah says, water break. Yes. Stomp says, at LeMay, but it's so funny. Okay. Thea says, can you say you love me, please? No, I don't love you. Darkness says, what the fuck? Okay. Jose says, bro looks like a ripoff Dustin from Stranger Things. Okay. Zero Cheese says, cheese egg is really cool and asks the best questions. Okay. Thea says, bah ha ha ha. Okay. Chunky Sweat says, Kirkland water. I am triangulating your location. Do not swat me, please. Auditing New Bedford says, I fart under covers with my head inside. Ew. Jay Corson says, how's your day been? Good, thank you. Hawktua says, shower thoughts. There are 2 E's in B, but they're both silent. Okay. LeMay says, guys, stop being rude. I don't mind. Salt Rifle says, do not look behind you. Okay. Billy the Jit says, do you play the flute? No. Saudi says, do you know I show speed? Yes. Atharva says, you are a wizard, Harry? Okay. Render Dragon says, hello. Hello. The Synth Wizard says, should I go get cereal? Yes. Garcia says, I am Don Benitez, and I like it in and around my mouth. Okay. Jan says, I bet your favorite word is okay. Yes. Bree says, hello. Hello, Bree. Jazzy says, if you could be in a movie, which would it be? An extra in Eyes Wide Shut. Not Sleep says, you dead, bro? No. Chunky Sweat says Don Benitez is a child prodigy of the skin flute. What? Hawk Tua says, do you like my shower thoughts? Yeah, but I don't like your spamming. Stomp says, you know I show speed like actually? Not personally. Rajat says, you are going to dress as a mini Jim Halpert today? No. Molly Leon says, hi. Hello, Molly. Goku says, how old are you? I'm an adult. Roman King says, Don, respond with $2 million, but can only fap once a month, or respawn with infinite lives, but you have to eat Big Macs every 30 minutes. Respawn with $2 million and can only fap once a month. VW says 12, okay. Shapeshifting says kindest thing you were told recently. I can't remember. Zero Cheese Egg says zero cheese egg says zero cheese egg. You broke the system. Gon says, would you eat a Big Mac ice cream? No. Miku says, do you like cookies? Yes. Leo says, do you have a girlfriend? No. Bree says, okay. Blink says, my ex-girlfriend has a big fat taco. Okay. Rich says, bro isn't surviving No Nut November. Okay. Dylan says, go back in time or visit the future. Visit the future. Blah says, you skip mind. Sorry. Joseph says, tell us where the bodies are. I don't bury people. Jan says, have you done a backflip before? No. Shadow Master says, Harry Potter is standing behind you. No, he isn't. Jan says, have you done a backflip before? No, I have not. Jamal DeQuifa says, hello, my Latino king. Did you see my edit yet? I haven't. Shapeshifting says, chimpanzee facts. Old chimps die when they stop living. Okay. Stomp says, did you try the Whopper Big Mac version from Burger King? I haven't tried it. Bowza says, is it pink? I don't have a vagina. Jan says, bye, Mr. Hand. Mr. Hands is leaving. Bye, Mr. Hands. Gon says, wee woo. Okay. Billy the Jit says, do you know any spells? No. Auditing says, are you related to Elon Musk? No. Jazzy says, what power would you choose? Flying or teleportation? Teleportation. Ashley says, do you like the smell of turtle farts? No. Kyle says, smoke weed? No. Jamal DeQuifa says, my Hispanic Latino king, when are you deleting this channel? Maybe never. I might stay here. Miku says, cookies or waffles? Cookies. Cheese Egg says, have you told us a single lie since you've been doing this? Yes. Dylan says, no heat again or no AC again? No heat. Chunky Sweat says, fap, goon, spank the chicken, pull the monkey, or cradle the goose? Masturbate. Gon says, Mickin' Chuggets. Okay. Mike says, I'm dumb. Okay. Zero Cheese says, what brand of toothpaste do you use? Colgate. Stomp says, laughing my ass off. Okay. LX says, tell shape-shifting sweetheart to post more chimpanzee facts. LX wants you to do more chimpanzee facts, shape-shifting. Ty says, yo mamas is the only inedible until AI. What? Mohammed says, why am I so dumb? I don't know. Bree says, are you autistic? I don't think so. StockX says, would you play the skin flute for free? I don't know what that is. Wait, is that a penis? No then. Thea says, he's going to be on Rigor Mortis? What's that? Shapeshifting says, Don Benitez facts. He likes people mostly. Okay. Okay. LJ says, what ethnicity are you? I don't know, like Hispanic, Latino. Ella Moja says, hi, remember me? I remember your name. Zero Cheese Egg says, what's the last show you watched? Better Call Saul. Gone says, are you losing it reading your comments? A tiny bit. Rich says, A sign? Okay. Auditing says, flat earther? I'm not. Thea says, what if I gave you 50,000 USD? I would appreciate it, but feel guilty that I'm taking your money. Roman King says, what did the FBI find in Jeffrey Dahmer's bathroom? Head and shoulders. Dark. Miku says, do you eat crayons? No. Nando says, would you rather spend a day with Kim Jong-un or Trump? Trump. Mark says, sup, where are you live? It's 5 a.m. in Boston. I'm gonna keep that private. Gaurav says, do you smoke? Maybe. Ashley says, can I eat shaving cream off of your fallopian tubes? I don't have those tubes. Darkness says, I tripped on Delsum and handful of times. What? Thea says, can I subscribe to you? Yes. Muhammad says, what do you prefer, your mom or 10 million? My mom. TZ says, what are you supposed to do when you realize you are starting to give up? Hang out with friends. The Synth Wizard says, I'm back and I have my Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Cool. Dylan says, control electricity or control gravity? Control gravity. Zero Cheese says, what is the answer to this question? I don't know. Bozapi says, would you kiss my soft black lips? No. Stomp says, what if someone insanely wealthy gave you 200K? Would you still feel guilty? Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would. Atharva says, kiss Taylor Swift or Nicki Minaj? Taylor Swift. Pretty Boy says, did you ever sack a cock? What? The Synth Wizard says, good night, Don. Good night, the Synth. Chunky Sweat says, oh no, step bro, I'm stuck. Okay. LX says, indica or sativa? Indica. Jamal DeQuifa says, can you sell merch, our Hispanic Latino king? Maybe in the future. Ty Winder says, booty bumps or bomb hits? No comment. Ella Moja says, who do you love more, your mom or your dad or both? Both. Darkness says, wait, you smoke weed? Maybe. Rob Johnson says, laughing my ass off? Okay. Auditing says, targeted individuals. What? Zero Cheese Egg says, do you love fish sticks? No. Albert says, hi from Blythe, California. Hello, Albert. Miku says, stinky cheese. Okay. Gon says, okay. Okay. TM says, can you buy me a PC? No. Ashley says, Mexicans have funny mustaches. Okay. Thea says, shotgun or rifle? Rifle. Auditing says, gang stalkers followed me last night. Be careful. Bozapi says, is it true you swallow